When Søren Kierkegaard says that truth is subjective, he is almost guaranteed to be misunderstood. To modern ears, the phrase sounds like relativism, the idea that truth is merely opinion, personal preference, or emotional sincerity. Kierkegaard means none of this. In fact, he would have regarded that interpretation as another way of avoiding responsibility. For Kierkegaard, the issue is not whether truth exists. The issue is how a human being stands in relation to it. Objective truth, in the ordinary sense, concerns facts that can be established independently of the individual. Historical dates, mathematical proofs, scientific measurements, these truths do not require personal commitment. One can know them without being changed by them. They are true regardless of how one lives. Kierkegaard has no quarrel with this kind of truth. His concern is with truths that lose their meaning if they are not lived. Questions about faith, meaning, purpose, responsibility, and selfhood cannot be settled objectively in the same way. One can understand every doctrine of Christianity, for example, and yet not be a Christian in any meaningful sense. One can describe ethical principles perfectly and still live evasively. One can analyze despair with precision and never confront one's own. In these domains, truth is not something one merely possesses. It is something one becomes related to. This is the sense in which truth is subjective. It refers not to the content of the belief, but to the mode of existing in relation to it. A truth that demands commitment cannot be grasped at a distance without being emptied of its force. Kierkegaard believed modern culture systematically ignored this distinction. Modern thought prized objectivity, detachment, and neutrality. These virtues are invaluable in science and scholarship, but destructive when applied indiscriminately to existence. When applied to faith or ethics, objectivity allows the individual to step outside the demand truth makes. One can evaluate rather than choose. One can analyze rather than commit. One can understand rather than live. Kierkegaard saw this as a form of self-deception. The individual convinces themselves that they possess truth because they can explain it, while their life remains untouched. Truth becomes information rather than obligation. Subjective truth exposes this evasion. It insists that certain truths are only true for an individual when they are lived. Until then, they remain abstract possibilities. This does not mean that sincerity makes something true. It means that truth without inward appropriation is incomplete. A belief held without commitment is not yet believed. A value admired without action is not yet valued. A faith understood without risk is not yet faith. Kierkegaard therefore reverses the usual philosophical priority. Instead of asking whether a belief is objectively correct, he asks whether the individual exists truthfully in relation to it. The danger for him is not error, but dishonesty toward oneself. This is why Kierkegaard can say that an objectively false belief held with absolute inward passion may be more truthful, existentially speaking, than an objectively correct belief held indifferently. The point is not that falsehood becomes truth, but that inwardness reveals the seriousness with which one relates to existence. Truth, in the existential sense, is a matter of how one lives, not merely what one knows. That claim is deeply unsettling. It removes the comfort of correctness and replaces it with responsibility. One cannot hide behind explanation, education, or doctrine. One must ask whether one's life corresponds to what one claims to believe. This is the starting point of Kierkegaard's notion of subjective truth, and without it, his entire philosophy collapses back into abstraction. Kierkegaard's distinction between subjective and objective truth rests on a deeper contrast: inwardness versus objectivity. Objectivity seeks distance. It aims to remove the individual from what is known, replacing involvement with neutrality. Inwardness does the opposite. It demands that the individual stand inside what they claim to believe. Kierkegaard believed modern culture overwhelmingly privileges objectivity, even in areas where it becomes destructive. The more detached a claim appears, the more credible it seems. Personal involvement is treated as bias. Passion is viewed with suspicion. Commitment is seen as irrational. This posture makes sense in science. It becomes evasive in existence. When objectivity is applied to questions of faith, ethics, or meaning, it allows the individual to relate to these matters as an observer rather than a participant. One can evaluate beliefs without choosing them. One can judge values without living by them. One can discuss meaning without risking anything personally. Kierkegaard saw this as a profound mistake. Certain truths are not diminished by involvement. They are destroyed by detachment. Faith, for example, cannot survive neutrality. An ethical commitment cannot be tested from the outside. To stand apart from such truths is already to fail them. Inwardness is therefore not emotionalism. It is responsibility. To exist inwardly means that one's beliefs are not merely held, but lived. It means that one's understanding is tied to action, risk, and consequence. An inward relation to truth is one in which the individual cannot step away without betraying themselves. Kierkegaard believed that reflection often masquerades as inwardness. A person may think deeply about their beliefs, analyze their motives, and articulate their values, all while remaining inwardly untouched. Reflection multiplies perspectives, but weakens decision. It creates the illusion of seriousness while allowing commitment to be postponed indefinitely. Objectivity supports this illusion. By treating existential matters as topics rather than demands, objectivity allows the individual to feel honest while remaining unchanged. One can say, "I understand the argument," instead of asking, "Am I willing to live this?" This is why Kierkegaard insists that inwardness cannot be replaced by correctness. A belief may be correct in every objective sense and still be existentially meaningless if it does not shape how one lives. Conversely, a belief may be flawed or incomplete and yet be held with a seriousness that transforms the individual. Kierkegaard does not praise error, he praises commitment. This emphasis radically shifts how truth is evaluated. Instead of asking whether a belief corresponds to reality in an abstract sense, Kierkegaard asks whether the individual exists truthfully in relation to it. Does the belief cost something? Does it bind the individual? Does it demand action? If not, then whatever its objective status, it remains existentially hollow. This is why Kierkegaard often seems hostile to philosophy itself. He is not rejecting reason. He is rejecting the use of reason as a shelter from responsibility. When reason becomes a way of avoiding commitment, it undermines existence rather than clarifying it. Inwardness restores the proper relation. It does not reject objectivity where it belongs. It insists that objectivity must stop where existence begins. Beyond that point, truth becomes a matter of how one lives, and no amount of explanation can substitute for that. Kierkegaard believed that modern individuals were rich in knowledge but poor in inwardness. They knew what faith was, what ethics required, what despair meant, and yet lived evasively, deferring commitment while mistaking understanding for seriousness. Subjective truth is Kierkegaard's attempt to correct this imbalance. It brings truth back into the sphere of existence, where it can no longer be admired safely. It demands that the individual stop asking whether something is true in general and begin asking whether they are willing to live as if it were true. That demand is what gives truth its weight. For Kierkegaard, the defining feature of subjective truth is passion, not emotion in the casual sense, but the intensity with which an individual commits themselves to what they believe. Passion is the mark of inwardness. It reveals that a belief matters enough to shape a life. This is why Kierkegaard treats passion as philosophically serious. Modern thought often treats passion as a liability. It is associated with bias, distortion, and loss of objectivity. Kierkegaard accepts this criticism in the realm of scientific inquiry, but rejects it entirely in the realm of existence. Where truth demands commitment, passion is not a defect. It is a requirement. A belief held without passion is inert. It may be correct, coherent, and defensible, but it does nothing. It does not bind the individual. It does not demand sacrifice. It does not expose the individual to risk. Kierkegaard believed that such beliefs are existentially empty, no matter how intellectually impressive they appear. Passion introduces risk. To commit inwardly to a belief is to risk being wrong, misunderstood, or even harmed by it. This risk cannot be eliminated by argument. It can only be accepted. Kierkegaard believed that many people avoid commitment precisely because they want to avoid risk. They prefer to remain spectators, protected by reflection and explanation. But without risk, there is no existence. This is why Kierkegaard insists that faith, in particular, cannot be justified in advance. If faith could be proven objectively, it would no longer be faith. It would become knowledge. Faith begins where justification ends, not because reason fails, but because existence demands a decision before certainty is available. This does not make faith arbitrary. It makes it costly. Kierkegaard is careful here. He does not praise passion for its own sake. Passion alone does not guarantee truth. One can be passionately wrong. But Kierkegaard insists that the absence of passion guarantees something worse, a refusal to exist inwardly. The individual who never risks commitment may be intellectually sophisticated, morally informed, and socially respectable, and still live evasively. Their beliefs never cost them anything. They are never tested by action. Commitment changes this. When an individual commits passionately, they place themselves under the claim they affirm. Their life becomes the site where the truth of the belief is tested. Success or failure can no longer be separated from existence itself. This is what gives subjective truth its seriousness. It is not about feeling strongly. It is about standing behind one's beliefs with one's life. Passion, in Kierkegaard's sense, is the willingness to let a belief shape decisions, priorities, and self-understanding. This willingness cannot be simulated. It cannot be replaced by sincerity, enthusiasm, or rhetorical intensity. It must be lived. And because it must be lived, it always involves uncertainty. One cannot know in advance whether one's commitment will be vindicated. Kierkegaard believed this uncertainty was essential. A truth that leaves no room for uncertainty leaves no room for responsibility. If outcomes are guaranteed, commitment becomes calculation. Passion disappears. Existence is reduced to procedure. By insisting on passion and risk, Kierkegaard restores the gravity of belief. He forces the individual to confront whether they are willing to live with the consequences of what they affirm. Subjective truth, then, is not comfortable. It removes the shelter of detachment. It exposes the individual to failure. It demands courage rather than correctness. And it insists that truth, where it matters most, is inseparable from how one lives. That is why Kierkegaard believed that truth must be subjective, or else it becomes a way of avoiding existence. Kierkegaard believed that one of the greatest dangers facing the individual was the desire to make inward commitment visible, explainable, or socially validated. Nowhere is this danger clearer than in his discussion of faith. Faith, for Kierkegaard, is not something that can be demonstrated publicly without being distorted. This is why he introduces the figure often called the Knight of Faith. The Knight of Faith is not heroic in the usual sense. There is nothing outwardly impressive about them. They do not announce their commitments, demand recognition, or appear exceptional. From the outside, they look ordinary. This ordinariness is essential. If faith could be recognized outwardly, it would become a social role. Kierkegaard insists that true inward commitment cannot be read directly from behavior, language, or public identity. The moment faith becomes something that can be displayed, it risks becoming performative. The individual begins to relate to how they appear rather than how they exist. This creates a problem of communication. If subjective truth is lived inwardly, how can it be communicated at all? Kierkegaard's answer is unsettling. It cannot be communicated directly without being corrupted. Any attempt to explain faith objectively turns it into doctrine. Any attempt to justify it publicly turns it into argument. In both cases, the risk disappears. This is why Kierkegaard treats faith as paradoxical. From the standpoint of reason, faith appears absurd. It involves commitment without sufficient evidence, trust without guarantees, and obedience without rational justification. Kierkegaard does not attempt to resolve this tension. He insists that resolving it would destroy faith itself. The individual who lives by faith must therefore accept misunderstanding. They cannot explain themselves fully without betraying the inward nature of their commitment. They cannot prove their faith without turning it into something else. They must live with the discomfort of being misread. This is not arrogance, it is humility. The knight of faith does not demand recognition. They do not claim superiority. They accept that their inward life cannot be translated into public categories. Their commitment remains between themselves and the demand they have accepted. Kierkegaard contrasts this with forms of religious life that seek visibility. When faith becomes publicly identifiable, it becomes vulnerable to imitation. People adopt the appearance of belief without the inward risk. Faith becomes a cultural marker, a set of behaviors, or a shared identity. Kierkegaard believed this was precisely what had happened to Christianity in his time. The result was a faith without danger. Subjective truth resists this transformation. It insists that the most important commitments cannot be made safe, public, or collectively validated. They must remain inward, costly, and exposed to uncertainty. This does not mean that the individual withdraws from the world. The knight of faith lives among others, participates in ordinary life, and fulfills ordinary responsibilities. What distinguishes them is not their behavior, but the inward seriousness with which they live. Kierkegaard believed that modern individuals desperately wanted faith without offense. They wanted belief without risk, meaning without sacrifice, and commitment without isolation. Subjective truth denies all three. It insists that existence is lived one individual at a time, without guarantees and without applause. This is why Kierkegaard's account of faith remains disturbing. It refuses to allow belief to become comfortable. It insists that what matters most cannot be made transparent, measurable, or socially secure. Faith remains a personal task, one that must be renewed inwardly, again and again. That task cannot be delegated. Kierkegaard was fully aware that the phrase subjective truth would provoke misunderstanding. He knew it would sound like a denial of objectivity, a retreat into opinion, or an excuse for doing whatever one feels. He rejected all of these interpretations. For Kierkegaard, subjective truth is not a permission slip. It is a moral demand. Relativism dissolves responsibility. Subjective truth intensifies it. Relativism says that because there is no objective standard, anything goes. Kierkegaard says almost the opposite. Because certain truths cannot be settled objectively, the individual bears greater responsibility for how they live. The absence of certainty does not excuse action. It makes action unavoidable. This is why Kierkegaard believed that the most dangerous posture was not error, but indifference. A person who believes wrongly but passionately has at least placed themselves under a demand. A person who believes correctly but indifferently has avoided existence altogether. The former risks themselves. The latter hides behind correctness. Kierkegaard does not celebrate falsehood. He insists that truth only becomes truth for an individual when it shapes their life. Until then, it remains a possibility rather than a reality. Subjective truth names the moment when belief becomes binding. This binding quality is what gives truth its ethical weight. To claim that one believes something is to claim responsibility for acting as if it were true. If one refuses that responsibility, then the belief has not been genuinely held. It has been admired, discussed, or explained, but not lived. Kierkegaard believed modern culture specialized in this kind of evasion. People spoke fluently about values they never enacted. They debated ethics without changing their behavior. They affirmed beliefs publicly while remaining inwardly untouched. This allowed them to feel serious without being accountable. Subjective truth exposes this dishonesty. It demands coherence between belief and life. It does not ask whether a belief can be defended abstractly, but whether the individual is willing to live with its consequences. This demand applies equally to religious faith, ethical commitment, and personal meaning. Kierkegaard insists that one cannot divide life into separate compartments. Belief here, action there, explanation everywhere else. Existence is unified. What one claims to believe inevitably expresses itself in how one lives. This is why subjective truth cannot be taught like a doctrine. It must be chosen, and because it must be chosen, it cannot be imposed. Kierkegaard does not tell the reader what to believe. He confronts the reader with the fact that they already live in relation to beliefs, whether they acknowledge them or not. Subjective truth simply makes this relation explicit. The discomfort this creates is intentional. It forces the reader to confront the distance between who they take themselves to be and how they actually live. It reveals the ways in which explanation, reflection, and social conformity can become strategies of avoidance. Subjective truth removes those shelters. It leaves the individual alone with their responsibility, not in despair, but in seriousness. Kierkegaard believed that this seriousness was the beginning of genuine existence. This is why subjective truth remains one of Kierkegaard's most important ideas. It does not dissolve truth into opinion. It does not excuse arbitrariness. It does not deny objectivity where it belongs. Instead, it insists that where truth matters most, it must be lived. Without this insistence, philosophy becomes commentary. Ethics becomes rhetoric. Faith becomes culture. And existence becomes something one explains rather than something one chooses. Kierkegaard's notion of subjective truth refuses that outcome. It demands that the individual stop hiding behind correctness and begin taking responsibility for how they live. That demand is uncomfortable, inescapable, and enduring, and it is precisely why Kierkegaard still matters.